Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session of Why Marx. We're starting today with a new sub-series that is focusing on the question of program. This has come about because the question of program has become a little bit contentious in the forging communist unity process. And there's been a lot of forward and backwards and disagreements. I mean, all, important, very much important to discuss the question of program anyway. But we thought this is a good time to take a closer look at the question of the program question. So from now until the beginning of Communist University, which is co-organized by all three organizations involved in the unity process, we're going to look at different aspects of the question of a party program in those 7 weeks, I think it is. Tonight, we're starting with a session introduced by Jack Conrad of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which is looking at the question of the relationship between party and program. As always, of course, we have lots of time for discussion and for questions from the floor, but we'll start with Jack now. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Yeah, I'm going to be talking specifically about the communist program. I'm sure there are all sorts of other things that can be described as a program. So the first thing to say, let's begin with at least my negatives. What isn't a program? And I suppose I could say that in general, an election manifesto isn't a program. If we mean by an election manifesto, this is sort of why we're standing. This is what we would do if we were elected, or something along those lines. Now, I'm not rejecting election manifestos, but I do think that a program is, how should I put it, more historical, more long-term, and it certainly should, at least in my opinion, avoid immediate, political events. So the program shouldn't, for example, in my opinion, comment on Rachel Reeves and her spending plans, or for that matter, the election of a Labour government. A manifesto, on the other hand, is very different. I would also say that a communist program shouldn't be what I would call a confession of faith. Now, I want to qualify that simply by looking back, because we all know, at least I'm presuming that we know what happened before the Communist Manifesto. We could perhaps view that, I think, legitimately as a program. But Engels, for example, produced 2 documents from my memory, and both were based on the Catholic catechism. So, a series of questions and answers. What do communists believe? Communists believe in this. How will communists go about achieving it? That sort of approach. Apparently, I mean, I haven't researched it, but apparently that was quite common in the workers' movement, very early, in the very early days, to produce such a document. So I'm excluding that, not well, I'm excluding that because I think it belongs to a primitive stage, but also in terms of what that conjures up. It does conjure up a religion. So nearer home, in terms of at least my background, is the Church of England's 38 Articles, which, as a Church of England member, you're meant to accept or believe in. I'm not quite sure. I never got to that stage, although I was brought up sort of Church of England-ish, and I went to a Church of England school. That stopped when I went to secondary school. So I got a vague idea of it, but I was, from my entire memory has been being an atheist. So I'm excluding that, both in terms of the particular format, but also on the idea that you have to believe that sort of this has the sort of the sniff of I don't know, tablets of stone. But I'd also add, again on the negative side, that the communist program shouldn't be a lowest common denominator document designed for the sake of unity, for unity's sake. Now, of course, there have been such documents, and the one that at least I've noted down, the one that comes to mind, the one that I'm sure comrades here know all about, is the 1875 Gotha program that was drafted by the followers of Marx, in particular August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, but also the leaders of the Lassallean party, a party, well, Germany's first workers' party, but both in terms of Lassalle and his successor, which I think his name was Schwartz or something like that. I'm not quite sure. Either way, these leaders acted as labor dictators. And we have, for example, in the Lassallean program, the idea of the iron law of wages, that in essence, trade union struggles are useless because as wages go up, prices would simply follow them. And what Lassalle emphasized was universal suffrage, which of course the Marxists championed as well, but they also didn't dismiss or ignore the economic struggle. I'm not going to go in and on about the Gotha program. Suffice to say, there are two arguments about it. The one that Marx fielded at the time, we've all read the critique of the Gotha program, where he basically puts forward his view that it would be better for the Marxists in Germany to remain separate, come to a working agreement with the Lassalleans. They viewed the Lassalleans as in decline as an organization. It had already produced a whole series of splits. We are told by Wilhelm Liebknecht that at some point much later, Karl Marx turned round to him, either directly or in correspondence. I don't know of any such correspondence, but I know the story, and said, well, Wilhelm, you were right. Because of course, what happened after the unification of these two organizations, and they weren't mass, but nonetheless, they were mass in our terms. They consisted of a few thousand comrades. What you had is a snowball. And the Social Democratic Party, I call it the Social Democratic Party, took off. And although it was banned, it dug deep roots in the working class. And when it emerged from illegality, it proved hugely successful in terms of establishing co-ops, trade unions, clubs, libraries. It became a state within a state. So, okay, I'm taking Marx's view in terms of what would be a good communist program. In other words, I'm saying don't start with diplomacy. Don't start on the basis of paring down your principles or adapting to the principles of Lassallean opportunism. Okay, so that's my sort of negative. Moving on to the positive, what do I think a communist program should be? Well, the first thing to say, I think it should be the basis of membership of an organization, both a pre-party organization, but also an actual party. And worthwhile, I suppose, saying what I mean by party. I don't mean some organization that calls itself a party. I mean by party part of the working class, a significant part of the working class, the leading part of the working class. So I'm not going to define it in numbers, but I am going to define it politically. So you could be illegal, only have a few thousand members, but the mass of workers, for example, could still look to that party as their leadership. They would take note of it, they would act upon what that party says. So we're not just talking about the word here, we're talking about a concept. Okay, so with that in mind, I would also say that the communist program does not require agreement. If it required agreement, then I think that we're into the, I don't know, the Communist Catechism, the Confession of Faith. I believe. The thing about communists is that we come in quite a few different varieties. We also, especially if we're rooted in the working class, will be coming into the party with a whole different variety of experiences and insights. And almost inevitably, what you'll have as a result of that is differences, sometimes quite important differences. And it's up to the party itself as it progresses, as it fights for the leadership of the working class, as it fights for revolution, to decide what is a legitimate difference and what is an illegitimate difference. And this is an art, it's not a science. So I'm not going to say that in the future, well, this is what would put you out of the party or that would put you out of the party. I think we can start by saying here and now that it's obvious that certain things would put you out of the party. So, for example, if someone is a genuine anti-Semite, I would say that such an individual, to put it mildly, their membership should be questioned. But I'm not going to go into, dotting I's and crossing T's here. The important thing is acceptance. And the idea of that is, well, I can live with that program on the basis that this is what the party will probably be doing in practice. This is what the party will be arguing for. And in my view, if we're talking about a party, if we're talking about the vanguard, the leadership of the working class, there will be all manner of differences, and in some respects, of course, that's a highly healthy thing. Otherwise, what we have is a piece of stone, precisely tablets of stone that have sort of been divinely revealed, aren't up for change. The thing about a program, it's a guide to action, and therefore, if reality changes, it needs to be amended. If reality changes dramatically, it needs to be amended dramatically. So this isn't a religious text. It's made by party members, and it can be remade and should be remade by party members. What it shouldn't require, though, is the election of a Labour government or the election of a Tory government or a coalition government or the election of a particular US president to change the program. The program should be deliberately written in a way that gives it a certain timelessness. So the program, in my view at least, should start off with a broad description of the historic epoch, the period that we live in. Nowadays, I don't think it's possible for a serious Communist Party not to deal with the Soviet Union. And what I'm referring to here is not a particular individual's theory or a particular group's theory of the Soviet Union. But you have to say, basically, do you think the experience of the 1930s was positive, or do you think it was a disaster? In my opinion, it was a disaster. In my opinion, the collapse was inevitable. But, you know, whether you take my particular opinion, I do think it's vital that the program says something about the Soviet Union, even if it's a sentence, even if it's a couple of sentences. But also, I think that the program itself should be informed by the fact of official communism, the so-called socialist states. What do they call themselves? You know, really existing socialism. You cannot escape from the shadow of those countries, let alone the fact, of course, that we still have so-called Communist Party governments in Cuba, Vietnam, above all, China. Now, we could take the view, I don't take the view, I can understand why, that you wouldn't want, therefore, to use the word communist, because it associates you with Stalin, you know, with Mao, or whatever. Again, in my opinion, you know, we'll always, whatever we call ourselves, we will be associated, you know, with that history, with that reality. And we can either decide to fight and explain to people, not in the program, but the program has to be informed by that we are different. We are radically different. Our approach is radically different. And why do I say that? Basically, because we want to be associated, not with Stalin, but I want to be associated at least with the October Revolution, with Lenin, with the Bolshevik Party that changed its name to the Russian Communist Party. I want to be associated with the formation of the CPGB. I'm not trying to dress it up into anything that it wasn't. I was a member of it, you know, at least in the YCL, Young Communist League, from the late 60s. I know what it was like. It was opportunist. It was ghastly in many respects. So, but I also want to be associated with Marx, with Engels, with the Communist Manifesto, and with that whole project. So we can either say, give it to the Communist Party of China, give it to the Stalinists, or have a battle with them that we are the genuine communists. And I think that in spite of the wealth of the Communist Party of China, we can win that argument. Either way, the program has to not only have a sense of the period that we're in, but also the period of history that we've come from, that in many ways is ghastly and negative. Hence, I think there has to be a very strong and explicit, maybe too much, but you know, I'm not convinced by that. There has to be an emphasis on democracy. We have to show, not only in practice, but also this is our understanding of the communist project, that our project is about fighting to win the battle of democracy under capitalism, which puts the working class in state power. And our project is to extend democracy to such an extent that the state itself withers away along with classes and the division of labor, and running society becomes more a question of habit, certainly not anything to do with, you know, the election of powerful individuals. Definitely favor Buggin's turn. Everyone, every cook, to quote State and Revolution, should learn to govern. And, you know, we should take a view in terms of the future. Oh my God, I've got to do administration now. I'm being drawn away by a civic duty, as opposed to something people aspire as a career to do. Okay, I also think a program, without getting into minute details, immediate details, has got to include immediate or minimum demands, and they've got to be worked out, and there has to be reasons for them. There has to be, how should I put it, knowledge behind it. So I don't myself favor the idea of, saying, well, we fight for everything that would be nice for the working class. That doesn't help us very much. It's no doubt true, but I think when it comes to hours, for example, just like in terms of the 19th century, we want the fight, our modern version of the fight, for the 10-hour day, for the 8-hour day. So we need specific aims. We need to be dealing with different sections of the population, not least over half of the population who are female. We don't just view workers as workers. We also look at the specific needs of women, but we also need to be looking at Britain's position in the world, the fact that it did have an empire, the fact that what we live under is a monarchy. They call it democracy. I reject that idea. To the extent there is democracy, it's hollowed out. But every democratic gain that we've made or achieved is the result of struggle. And we want to extend that struggle, because it's in the fight to extend democracy that the working class is able to learn how to prepare itself to become a ruling class. To use the Hegelian idea, we go from a class in itself that's exploited, that's a slave class, to a class for itself, a class that is conscious of itself and conscious of its mission to actually abolish itself along with all classes, the state, and realize general and individual freedom. So the program has got to encompass immediate tasks as well as the long-term aim. Okay, I'm going to start to come to a conclusion by asking the question, what comes first? Does the party come first, or does the program come first? Now, we can get into, I don't know, a what about this, a what about that, because it's certainly true that if you take, for example, the original Communist Party of Great Britain, 1920, it didn't have a program. It didn't begin with a program. But on the other hand, I would argue, well, it sort of did. It was called Comintern. It was called the Russian example. So no, it didn't have a program. I think there was a draft program in 1924. Its first program, I think, was 34. I'm not sure, but anyway, class against class, which is appalling, is an election manifesto. And of course, the official party then went on in the early 50s to adopt the British Road to Socialism, very similar to Militant's program, or should I say Militant's program, Militant What We Fight For, written by Peter Taff, is very similar to the British Road to Socialism. This influenced the Labour left. Why? Because it's, in essence, it envisaged socialism coming about through a series of left and lefter Labour governments with some communists either standing as communist candidates or as Labour communist candidates, but also it predicated on a peaceful road. I've got no problem in wanting a peaceful road, but crucially, it was predicated on doing it through Parliament. And I'm all in favour of winning a majority in the House of Commons, but anything that anyone who knows anything about the UK Constitution knows that Parliament not only consists of the House of Commons, but also the House of Lords and also the monarch. And it's the monarch that has to sign the laws, and the state's forces, not least the army, swear loyalty to the monarch. So I cannot imagine this being a practical road, for example. The British Road to Socialism says, well, the army wouldn't rebel because, well, they just wouldn't, because we've won the. I just don't. I don't buy that. Maybe they wouldn't rebel, but the key question of why they wouldn't rebel is that we've won the loyalty of some regiments, some units, but also because we've shifted from a professional army, for example, to a popular militia. Either way, what I want to argue here is that in terms of method, where we are today, and we can look at various examples in the past, I would urge comrades to look at the Russian example. It's not because I'm dreaming of reenacting the storming of the Winter Palace or anything like that, simply because the Russian experience led to victory, was concertinaed, was very much led by people who were informed by the best Marxism that was available in the world at the time. And so therefore what I'm arguing is that a program comes first. You don't wait before you write the program for you to have X thousand members. I actually think you begin with the program first, and the party itself is a product of, it's an outgrowth of the program. So for example, using my Russian example, if we look at the first group of Russian Marxists living in Switzerland, Plekhanov and all the rest of them, they were drafting a program for a party that had no immediate prospect. Certainly if we look at Lenin in prison and also then in exile in Siberia, after the abortive first Congress of the RSDLP, he really put his nose to the grindstone in terms of producing draft programs, which then eventually became, after a few years, Plekhanov's draft program, heavily amended by Lenin and Martov and other comrades, that was presented to the real founding Congress of the RSDLP, Brussels, and then London, the second Congress. I'm not going to go into the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Suffice to say, and this is really my point about things not being tablets of stone, in the midst of the first Russian Revolution, 1905, Lenin wrote Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, and I would very much characterize that pamphlet as a supplement. You could call it an amended version of the program, but the Bolsheviks retained their program that had been agreed at the Second Congress all the way through to 1919. It's true that they wanted to amend it in 1917, in the summer of 1917. Bukharin, for example, wanted to get rid of the entire minimum section of the program in 1917, before they'd overthrown the provisional government. He made the same proposal in 1919. Lenin successfully argued, maybe wrongly, maybe rightly, to keep the minimum program because there was the possibility of them being forced to retreat, and maybe the party would have to operate again under conditions of capitalism. But the point I'm making here is that the program isn't a holy text. It's open to amendment. It's a living document. It can be amended, but it can also be supplemented. So Lenin's strategy, he characterized it as uninterrupted revolution. Plekhanov had already been putting forward the idea of the working class taking a lead in the overthrow of Tsarism. He'd ceased to look to the model of the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie leading what Marxists all the way through up to 1917 and after talked about as the bourgeois revolution. Lenin said, okay, not only should there be working class leadership, but the working class should align itself, not only leading the peasantry to overthrow Tsarism, but if it's successful in doing that, the working class, in alliance with the peasantry, should constitute itself the state power in the form of a provisional revolutionary government. And one of the tasks of the revolutionary provisional government is to sweep away every vestige of Tsarism, but also perhaps, depending on their strength, depending on what's going on in Europe, perhaps to launch a revolutionary war that triggers the socialist revolution in Europe. If you look at Leon Trotsky, he was coming to a very, very similar argument if you look at results and prospects. And while the two of them fought, like cats and dogs because of factional alignments, the reality is that they were actually very close. Rosa Luxemburg too, I think there was an incident where she looked at Lenin's proposals at a unifying Congress of the RSDLP and said, do you mean by what you're putting forward your uninterrupted revolution? Do you mean permanent revolution? And he said, of course I do, because this is something, of course, that goes back to the post 1848 period, Karl Marx and all the rest of it. Anyway, I'm going to come to a close with that. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks very much, Comrade. Interesting opening, comrades. If you want to make a contribution, ask questions, please click raise hand and I'll bring you in. I'll start off with a couple of questions, if that's okay, Jack. I mean, I think sort of summing up your approach to program, I suspect it's, it has to be as short as possible, but as long as necessary. So ideally, if the working class really understood everything we were saying already, it could be quite short, etc. And if we were in a revolutionary upheaval, perhaps you need more answers, etc. But in terms of that, there's also a possibility, of course, to have some issues perhaps supplemented elsewhere, that you don't put everything in the program because you're explaining it elsewhere, because there is, of course, a discussion at the moment, not just in the communist fusion process, but also in the Corbyn party, which might or might not be with us, upon us fairly soon, within a few weeks. I suspect that's going to be a very short can we call it program? It's going to be a very short few points, because they of course arguing is the longer your program, you put off people. So the more detailed you become, you put off people. You're not going to be able to convince them to join your fight for socialism because it's too detailed, and they're going to disagree with everything. Where do you see that kind of issue between long and short? And then sort of related to that, we've had discussion about, should you have something about the transition to communism in your program, because that's so far off. You run the risk of, by putting it in your program, you run the risk of talking about what's going to happen in 100 years, and it's going to be too detailed. You need to talk about different classes, etc. Or are you saying this actually will affect your strategy for today? So the problem between long and short, if you could say something on that, that'd be interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm certainly of the short school. If you look, I mean, I think I did a word count, for example, of the last edition of the British Road to Socialism, and I think it came in at something like 30,000 words. And if someone wants to correct me, that's fine. But I think it's about 30,000 words. If you look at the draft program of the CPGB, I mean, it should be said, I think it comes in at about 12,000, but that also includes an introduction. Where we from? What is this organization? Is this the official Communist Party? No, we want to make that clear. So we haven't come out of thin air. We're not, like Athena from the head of Zeus, suddenly appears. That's a couple of pages. We've also got a description of the Communist Party. Now, you could say that's not needed, but again, given the bureaucratic centralism of the existing left, I actually think it is needed. It's not superfluous. Why are you different? Well, we all declare that we're for democracy. We all say that we're jolly nice people, but I think the draft rules are worthwhile putting in there because precisely it makes it clear that while you're obliged to accept the program, you can disagree, and not only disagree. I remember reading, what's his name, my friend Andrew Northall, our resident Stalinist letter writer in the Weekly Worker. He said, I can change the program of the CPB, what's it called, Britain's Road to Socialism. All I need to do is win my branch, which is Kettering. Well, that's precisely the problem. He's not allowed by rule to contact co-thinkers. He's not allowed to draft an alternative with his co-thinkers in London or Birmingham or Glasgow. In our approach to a party, just like the Bolsheviks, of course you are. So I think that's needed. Ditto with the Socialist Workers' Party. You're only allowed to form a faction in the pre-conference period. Well, no, because you want to be thinking. If you want to reject state capitalism, for example, maybe you need a study circle, and maybe it lasts several years. So I do think that's needed. So yeah, our program is short. On the other hand, I like your phrase, as long as necessary, and I've sort of made the argument of why the program we've got at the moment, at least, is longer than the program, for example, of the Russian Communist Party, which I think was about 10,000 words. So it's roughly the same as this, simply because of the experience, the negative experience of what's passed off as socialism, what's passed off as communism. So I think more detail is required. And the same applies to the transition period. Are we wanting to repeat China? No. Are we wanting to repeat the Soviet Union? No. Do we look to Cuba as a model? If not, why not? And we're saying that you only get to communism through a radical democratic revolution that has to be not only internationalist, verbally, but has to be internationalist in practice. Maybe we fail, but what we're saying is that here we are in Britain. We cannot possibly succeed in Britain. At the very least, it's got to be a European scale for us to have any chance. So we, at least in my view, we've got to deal with Europe. We've got to deal, exactly, with changing the world balance of forces. And we've got to deal with the idea, at least in my opinion, that the class struggle continues after the revolution, not only against the remnants of the bourgeoisie and international counter-revolution. We've got to deal with the middle classes. And in my view, we've got to deal with the middle classes carefully, gently. We've got to win them to socialization voluntarily. Now, how long that would take, I don't know, but we've also got to change ourselves. The communist principle is to each according to their needs. And I've heard you, Tina, for example, say, I know this is slightly unfair, maybe, I need to be able to go into space. Well, maybe, I'm not going to stop you. But, if we all consume like Jeff Bezos or, Elon Musk or the billionaire class, that's not my vision of communism. So again, we've got to change people. We've got to change people so they act responsibly, so that we're acting out of habit and consciousness, and we're not just greedy bastards that go around taking it because we can. Maybe I'm being unfair to you, but that's the explanation.
I don't recall wanting to go.
I remember it well, but anyway, there you are. So that's my answer. Yeah, cheers.
Sounds a bit well, actually, but thanks for that. Yeah, so comrades have been asking, how long is a piece of string? It all depends, isn't it? And it depends on the level of abundance, etc., and how far comrades are developed and the international situation. One question then on, there's a bit of a discussion in the chat on the role of democracy, and you mentioned it's a state within a state, which is a formulation, I believe, from the social democracy in Germany, or in describing what they were arguing for, at least, that we build up our own organizations. We fight for reforms of the bourgeois institutions, but we're also building our own institutions and democratically, etc. So we're doing both things. And there's somebody in the chat said our role is not to fight for bourgeois democracy. Our role is to abolish the state, etc., and do away with it. And you've been saying, I mean, of course, we don't fight for bourgeois democracy. We fight for democracy, for the working class. Do you see a difference between that? What is the role of fighting for democracy within the class struggle and the communist movement?
Well, personally, I think that the term bourgeois democracy is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. And I actually did read recently, I mean, I know it was a quote from a long time ago, but I did come across, what's his name? Peter Thiel, the far-right billionaire in America, making exactly that point. He said that bourgeois democracy is an oxymoron. He wants to get rid of what democracy they have in the United States because he thinks it interferes with the capitalists. And well, I sort of agree with him. The capitalists are not a democratic class. How can they be? They're a tiny minority. And if they were Democrats, when you go to work, they would say, okay, Tina, okay, Jack, let's elect the manager. Let's together decide what we produce and how we distribute it. I've never been in a workplace remotely like that. What we actually have in the workplace is the naked dictatorship of the capitalist class. If you don't like it, I'm going to sack you. That's their approach. So in my view, and I think you can show it historically, while the bourgeoisie has democracy for itself, very much like a shareholder democracy of one vote, one share, they've never championed, unless it comes to somewhere else, one person, one vote. We fought for that. So this was the gain of the Chartists, it was the gain of the suffragette movement, it was the gain of the working class movement in Britain, that we ended up with one person, one vote. Now they hollow it out, they bureaucratize our organizations, and in many senses, the communist struggle is therefore not only about the enemy without the bourgeoisie, our boss class, it's also about overcoming the enemy within the bureaucracy, the trade union and labor bureaucracy, which also operates, in our small left-wing organizations. So if we look at the SWP, if we look at SPEW, and we have to have a situation that, for example, my own organization has to have a position of where it can turn around to old gits like me and said, well, time to put you out to grass. Now, I'm not volunteering straight away, but I'm getting older. But that must be part of our struggle. So precisely taking back our trade unions, extending democracy, not bourgeois democracy, but working class democracy. So yeah, there's always a danger of us being banned by the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie, certainly in countries like Britain, operate much more subtly. So the trade union movement, for example, becomes a sort of instrument of maintaining capitalist rule as opposed to ending a capitalist rule. Now, should we give up on the trade union? Should we boycott trade unions? I think that would be foolish. In the same way, we have the opportunity of standing in elections. Doesn't mean that when you get elected, if we had a majority in the House of Commons, you've got power, but to use Parliament as a, something to talk to millions of people, we should use that opportunity. So, yeah, I personally have never liked the word bourgeois democracy. And I know Marxists have used the term, but I much rather use the term democracy that we've won under the bourgeoisie. That's really my approach on that particular question.
So the way we organize is, as democratic as we can. You use the word extreme democracy. We fight for extreme democracy in the here and now. Is communism democratic?
Well, again, we can get into if it's a form of the state, no. If it's, well, what shall we do about X, Y, or Z? I decide. It's not going to be like that. So, for example, if I've learned a lot from people like Chris Knight and the Radical Anthropology Group, and they've gone out to, I don't know, Kenya and Tanzania and the Congo. And there you are, you've got various what I'd call original communists still there. They don't have a state. And actually, when it comes to deciding what to do, actually what tends to happen, as I understand it, is it's usually the women, not on the basis of a vote, but they just sort of nod and wink. Now, I don't know. The point I'm making here is that I don't know what communism will look like in the future. We know what communism looks like roughly contemporarily, in small surviving pockets. We can guess what it looked like perhaps, 100,000 years ago. But the point I would make about the use of the word democracy, if we're getting rid of the state, clearly democracy withers away, but decision making would still have to be done, but it wouldn't be done on the basis, I've got a gun, I've got a police force, I've got prisons. No. And so again, I don't know, would groups be able to do their own thing? Again, I've got no, I just don't want to go there because this is really for the future to sort out. All I would insist on is the state in terms of human history, hopefully will be a passing phase, something that came into existence, 5,000 BC for the first time and would go out of existence, not in 5,000 years' time, but maybe in what you talked about, Tina, maybe, maybe that's pessimistic, but I wouldn't reject it. 200 years, certainly I would talk about a couple of generations because we've got to change ourselves. I've been brought up under capitalism. I'm an egotist, because of capitalism. We are selfish because of capitalism. So people like me, hopefully, we'll all be dead, but hopefully there'll be a better generation of people. Our children's children will be more fit for communism than someone like myself.
Let's hope. Okay.
Let's
One
hope.
last question then before I bring in Ian, because I know Ian is not a supporter of the transitional method, but looking around the left, that is, of course, the prominent, the dominant position that you believe in the transitional program of Trotsky, written in 1938. Why do you think? It was written in a period where Trotsky quite clearly expected the collapse of capitalism, and many others did. So it was kind of understandable why he thought, you're putting forward any demand really in the here and now, and that will transition into something that really takes on the capitalist system. Why do you think it's still the most dominant form on the left of program, and how do we overcome that?
Well, if we put the transitional program, as I would, under the umbrella of economism, then it is the dominant view. So you've mentioned Corbyn. I haven't looked at their draft, but I suspect that they would have some sort of argument saying, well, if you get people in struggle around the most minimal questions, this will teach them. And, with the eating, the appetite grows. You could describe that, for example, as sort of what Trotsky, I would argue, was reduced to. Why? Because it wasn't just that he was looking into the future and going, oh my God, World War II is coming. Anyone could see that. But what he was looking at is his own forces. And what he had, I think, on a global scale was a few thousand comrades, where you had official social democracy, official communism. His comrades had no decisive leadership of the working class. So, again, we can look at Trotsky's history, being a factionalist until 1917. Either way, I do think that we paid a heavy price for it. And I think the illusion that the comrades have got is really that their little group, by putting forward the most minimum demands, will sort of be the Bolshevik party. I just think that that's a profound mistake. The Bolshevik party was a party, won the majority of working class votes in Tsarist elections, won the majority of votes in Soviet elections, won the majority of votes in trade union elections. But what we have is the idea precisely that one of the 57 varieties is really the Bolshevik party. And that also excuses splitting. So instead of accepting the program, accepting being in a minority, I mean, we all want to be in a majority. It's much nicer, when you're in the majority. It's hard being in a minority. I've been in a minority, in the official Communist Party and various other organizations. I much prefer to be in a majority. But okay, if we're going to build a party, we've got to have a culture of where we accept being in a minority. And okay, what I'm arguing is that that's perfectly acceptable to me, because if I've got the ability, for example, not as a, how should I put it, I must do it, but if I've got the ability, the freedom to form a faction, to publicly argue my case, then that would, I think, at least create a situation of where it's more acceptable to be in a minority. So instead of that, what we have is various comrades saying, I've got a disagreement on this, and I've got a disagreement on that, and therefore I'm splitting. And this just produces, in my view, we'll just look around the left, it doesn't produce strength, it produces weakness, and it turns us into gravel, social gravel. And not only do we have the 57 varieties, we've got hundreds of sects of one. And I don't think that's the future. Well, maybe it's the future. If that's the future, we haven't got a future. So I think we need to learn to live with each other and to accept votes. Sometimes the votes will go against us and we'll be upset about that. But if we don't develop that culture, I think we're in a hopeless position. So all I can say, looking back to my example, the Russian Revolution, at the Second Congress, Lenin found himself in a minority. He didn't walk. It was Martov that went on strike. It was the Bund that walked. It was the economists that walked. When Lenin was in the minority, he argued for minority rights. Well, that's what I would do. But when he's in the majority, okay, he then turns around to the others and said, well, we had a vote, we had a fair debate. It's now your turn. And that's really my approach. So minorities, majorities, we all want to be in a majority, but we need the ability to persuade people that, that we were worthy to become a majority. I think that's the way forward for the left. That's
And publicly so, because most Trotskyist organizations will say, yeah, we have internal factions and people are allowed to disagree internally. It's just you're not allowed to do it in the publication. You're not allowed to win people over to your, to become the majority, and at least not in public, and that is a problem, isn't it? Okay, comrades, if anybody has a comment, a question, criticism, we're very keen on critical comments, always make the best debates. Please come in, click raise hand, and I'll bring you in. Ian's got a comment.
Good evening, Jack. Thanks for the presentation. Very good. Now, as people will already know, I'm happily a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but I didn't. It's a fairly recent thing, the last couple of years. My move away from Stalinism, I joined the YCL at the tender age of 13 in 1974. But my movement away from Stalinism was a slightly different route. I'd read Anton Pannekow and Hermann Gorter before I'd read Trotsky. I would also advocate reading Trotsky, not only as a magnificent writer, but as an important corrective to Stalinism. The reason why council communism was attractive to me was because of that whole sorry history of the idea of a Bonapartist usurpation of power by a party leadership. But as time goes on, of course, one studies things a bit more, and any kind of study of the workers' councils that were thrown up in Germany, in the German Revolution, of course, one can see that they weren't just expressions of working class power, although they were that. They were also riven with factions and parties. Famously, Max Weber, no friend to Marxism, was a member of a workers' council. And people were able to manipulate those workers' councils actually for a opportunist objective. So one of the reasons why I joined the CPGB is because of the importance of an organisation that can think about things in a non-dogmatic way. I've been in an organisation of less than 10, the Movement for Workers' Councils in London, meeting over a pub to read the works of Gorter and Panico. Excuse me. And to find that the council communists that I knew were just as dogmatic as many Trotskyist sects, just as dogmatic as many Stalinists. And that was one of the features that was, of course, disillusioning, as well as interesting in terms of learning what I thought was quite a useful tendency within Marxist thought to ask questions like, how do we stop a Bonapartist reaction in the future? How do we make sure that the working class is in control rather than a group at the top of a so-called party? And so I'd be grateful if we could explore a little bit more of this idea about the relationship between party, as in organisations, and the class. My feeling is that, in a sense, I think this is what you were alluding to, was that the Communist Party is that part of the proletariat which is politicized for its own liberation, and in so doing the liberation of all humanity. The other thing is, I wanted to ask a little bit about novel forms, as it were, because after all, the Paris Commune was a novel expression of proletarian power. They weren't, of course, all proletarians. The Soviets, Soviet in Russian is just council, were seen with some suspicion when they grew up in 1905. And one of the reasons why Trotsky's magnificent book 1905 is so remarkable is because, of course, he was there. And I'd recommend a reading of that to anyone. So we can, if novel forms have been thrown up in the past, the likelihood is they're going to be thrown up again in the future, and it's a question of how we adapt to that. And the other thing about being in an organisation, whether you call it a party or whatever you call it, is the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. This was a thing that seems to have been a problem within the German party, that in a sense the extent to which people were in a sense prepared for the betrayals that they saw, and that perhaps it should have split sooner. And a couple of other just little things around the question, for example, of distribution according to need. I'm kind of less afraid of that than most. I mean, no one should pretend that the National Health Service is sort of a little island of socialism. Although I would defend free healthcare with my life, it was clearly not something that owes much to socialism. But the most appealing part of it to everybody is distribution according to need. The fact that you can have healthcare when you need it, and people don't generally abuse it. I mean, people, you get kind of nutters in the Sun or something talking about people taking advantage of it. But actually, in my experience of years and years working in the NHS, people don't really abuse it. They wish it was better. They wish it would work better. But but the reasons why it doesn't is precisely because it doesn't have any internal democracy, precisely because the people who actually work in the NHS have very little say over it at all. Another one I just wanted to mention was about the question of scarcity. Capitalism is, in a sense, a precondition for socialism because it creates the conditions for abundance. But of course, there's always going to be a scarcity of villas by the Adriatic or whatever. But in a socialist society, you could actually deal with that in a rational way. I've no particular wish to own a house or a car or whatever. It doesn't bother me whether I've got title deeds or whatever. And I think surprisingly people will adapt quite quickly. I'm not very optimistic in the short to medium term because the left appears to be on the bones of its arse. But I am optimistic in the longer term. When you think about great crises like the Second World War or whatever, it was remarkable how people adapted to a kind of spirit of egalitarianism which hadn't really existed beforehand. And whilst I don't want to sort of be misty-eyed about it, there's some very interesting data about what happened to the health of people during the Second World War. If you weren't actually bombed or shot, the health of the population was remarkably good, not least of which because of the diet, but also because of a sense of oneness, a coming into being of society as a collective. And it's that collectivity that we don't have at the moment. It is atomized and fragmented, and that finds its expression in the political formations that have been thrown up. So one thing I am optimistic about is that if you do get to a situation where you have a collectivity within the class will change remarkably quickly. That seems to be what historically has happened in the past. And I think that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you, Jack.
Thanks, Ian. We've got Ant with his hand up. Do you want to wait for him to speak, Jack, or do you want to reply to Ian now?
I'll let him come in.
Thank you, Jack. Okay. Once again, I think we inevitably return to topics which we have approached various times, because these are the central topics. These are the central ideas of communism, and they can't be avoided. I'm going to say, all your talk about democracy without specifying that we only require proletarian democracy, to me, it's simply a case of you are advocating capitalism. I'm going to try and clarify this somewhat. I think that the actual revolution cannot be carried out by any minority claiming to represent the working class, the people, or the nation, or any other such formulation. And it's not, the problem is not the size of the minority. So yeah, we can argue that what was the Bolshevik Party a mass party? Okay, at certain points it was thousands, at certain points it was tens of thousands. On the eve of revolution, it was hundreds of thousands. So I would say, generally speaking, it wasn't a mass party, but it did become, arguably a mass party. But I don't think that is the issue at all. The size of the minority is not the issue. The size of the party is not the issue. I think we need to reject the formulation made during a recent Labour Left Alliance Zoom that the class is the party, or the party is the class, or any other such formulation which equates the party and the class as being the same. The party consists chiefly of the advanced elements of the class who have come to class consciousness, and the need for revolution, the need for the working class to take political power as the initial step to transform society. And this level of consciousness is actively prevented by the ruling capitalist class. And I think it's, what the CPGB is saying is one more example of it, standing against the power of the working class. I think that obviously the ruling class dominates through entities like political parties, but more covertly, the media in general, even what passes for entertainment and many other channels, for example, education. According to Karl Marx, this situation of class consciousness being relatively marginalized within a relative minority requires a revolutionary process to change. So the conscious minority will only be able to generalize its revolutionary perspective, the idea of the working class taking power within the context of an extreme situation of high class struggle. It's only in such a situation the working class over and over has created its own mass organs of struggle in the face of the inadequacy of those which exist more or less permanently under capitalism. But these organs, these mass organs of the self-created mass organs of the working class, historically workers' councils, Soviets, even if they do encompass a large layer of the class, they are truly mass organs. They don't automatically come to a revolutionary perspective, which is a recognition of the need to take power through the creation of a governing organ. But here, the conditions can exist for a solution. So a revolutionary vanguard, in other words, the party that we are talking about, the party that both of us say is absolutely necessary. Yeah, so don't distort my words on that, please. In my mind, the party is absolutely necessary. I don't subscribe to the ideas of council communism, which deny the role of a party. But a revolutionary vanguard, a revolutionary party can fight within the mass organs for the revolutionary perspective, rather than a deal with the ruling class. It can fight for the taking of power by the mass self-organization of the class. Okay, so that's our revolutionary strategy, to quote McNair's title. Now, the working class does not simply delegate its power to a revolutionary party. That's a recipe for a new ruling class. But through the exercise of proletarian democracy, delegatory democracy, the class-conscious revolutionary vanguard can gain an influence within any central body we can create through delegatory democracy. So we see that each of these elements is a necessity. But if you consider each element in isolation, they're all insufficient. So the bulk of the working class doesn't become revolutionary simply through self-organization for its own defense, setting up councils or Soviets, to use a Russian term, but setting up its own mass organs, which initially will be for the defense of the class under capitalism. And equally, the party cannot simply take power by any mechanism whatsoever, some parliamentary enabling, or I don't know, whatever. The party cannot take power and dictate socialism from on high. Socialism can only be implemented by willing masses working it out in the attempt. However, in the interaction, the coming together, the interaction between the revolutionary party and the bulk of the class in self-created organs of struggle, the elements of genuine proletarian political power are present. So I totally agree. No revolutionary party, no revolution. Yes. But that doesn't mean that a revolutionary party is a government in waiting, that the class simply voting a communist party or a party comes to power by any other manner, in any other manner. Proletarian democracy remains a necessity. Members of any political party have no more right to be delegated, subject to immediate recall to any central organ than any other person. The working class is not represented by a separate minority. It rules through delegates, which are constantly subject to the will of the class. The working class rule, this working class rule, this power of the working class doesn't come from parliament, from winning majorities in elections or joining coalition governments to legislate for the power of proletarian bodies, whiwhich can only arise in moments of highest class struggle.
Can you start winding up now, comrade?
Yeah, I will do. Yes. So, give me 1 minute, please. In his latest article, McNair, "Capitalism as a Star Castle," says, and he seems to make the case for proletarian power like I do almost. But he says, "These, I argued, illustrate the fundamental differences between the CPGB's views of the transition period and those of official communism. We in the CPGB fight for radical democracy, while official communists cling to bureaucratic managerialist ideas. We reject socialism in one country, national rota socialism, and alliances with either the democratic bourgeoisie or the national bourgeoisie, all defended by official communists. Okay, end of quote. Sounds quite good. However, phrases about radical democracy and democratic republicanism and all the rest, while rejecting the power of the workers' own self-created organs, historically the council, the Soviets, as he repeatedly does, and I quoted them in the chat, yes, over and over again. All those nice sounding phrases about radical, extreme republican democracy mean no more than perhaps varying the face of the ruling class if you exclude the proletariat's own self-created organs. Thank you.
Jack, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Where are we? Ian, I don't know why we didn't come across each other. Your journey is an interesting one. I also I sort of took a time off to read exhaustively Lenin and Trotsky. I sort of touched upon council communism. Why? Simply because I think that you know, how should I put it, a precondition of going forward is to account for what happened. I don't think that we've got a chance unless we can explain what happened. That doesn't mean I'm looking just to quote Trotsky or just look at Lenin's, I think, rather sad writings, you know, in the early 20s. But I do think that we do need more than good intentions. So when it comes to the program, that's why I've argued that we do need to put more detail in than you would have, for example, in the 19th century. I didn't know about Max Weber. That's an interesting little aside. Do we expect organs of one sort or another to arise? Yeah, I would guess so. So in our draft program, I think we reference that possibility. But what I wouldn't do is fetishize Soviets. I do find it, I mean, I sort of understand why, but the word means, as Ian said, council. And this was in conditions, remember, the word is developed, you know, in Russia, we want councils. And so you not only had factory councils, you had district councils. Trotsky led the capital city council. But the fact of the matter is that if we look at Britain, there are plenty of councils. And the real question is, of course, that they haven't got any noteworthy power, but why can't they? Why can't they? If you take the Paris Commune, it wasn't based on factory, enterprises. It was based on districts, for example. And the reason why it had a massive, overwhelming proletarian majority is that the bourgeoisie fled because of German/Prussian troops. So who knows what the future will produce? But I think Ant referenced it, that Soviets by themselves aren't the answer. And that's absolutely right. So, okay, in Russia, not 1905, but 1917, much to the shock of the Bolsheviks, who thought of themselves as the majority party, when it came to the first Soviet elections, they were absolutely horrified to find themselves getting what, 10%, 14% of the vote. And okay, Lenin, could see that the revolutionary crisis was there, could see society collapsing, and looked around to things like shop stewards and said that the Soviets are dead because they're dominated by the Socialist Revolutionary Party and the Mensheviks. So we shouldn't fetishize one particular form, or because it's new, this must be the answer. Who knows what the future will bring? And that's, I think, the point about a program, that we're not trying to second guess. We're open to what the future might bring. But we're not laying it down. So we're not insisting on factory councils. We're not insisting on where we've got, I'm in London, so we must have our alternative to Camden Council. Well, why on earth can't we get a massive majority on Camden Council or Sheffield Council and turn it into something else? I don't know why. The Red Army is an example. I mean, made up of peasants with Tsarist officers, but with communist commissars. So would we want that? Would we aim for that? No, but reality, produced such a formation. Also produced the Red Guards, but it also produced regiments that were loyal to the Revolutionary Military Committee of the St. Petersburg, or should I say Petrograd, Soviet by then. Okay. Ian, on the NHS, I agree. I think it is a sort of socialist institution. I do think socialization is happening under capitalism. I do think that the working class makes gains. The thing about the National Health Service, as you quite rightly point out, is that it isn't controlled by those that work in it or those that consume it. And of course, it's radically starved of funds. So I don't know what it's like, where you live. If I ring up, my local GP and say, can I have an appointment? They say, well, in 2 weeks' time. I said, well, I could be dead in 2 weeks. So, yeah, free at the point of use. When I get to the GP, they don't charge me, but try getting to a GP. Go to accident and emergency. And get treated unless you're dying. And even if you're dying, they'll leave you on a trolley for about 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours. I mean, so yeah, I'm in favor of need, but the NHS is obviously radically failing in that way. Either way, you know it far better than I do. And I'm not trying to paint you as someone who wants to get rid of the National Health Service. As you say, you would die for it. But yeah, I do think you raise, again, an interesting thought game. What about the villas next to the Adriatic? How are you going? Who gets to live in them? Do they? I don't know, but I would hope that there will be a civilized solution to that. Whether that means each having a timeshare, I don't know. But you're right. Actually, when it comes down to it, we can talk about abundance. But we shouldn't imagine that everyone can have their own island. That's what I would, that's really what I'm trying to say. So to me, the question of abundance is much more about what Marx talked about, which isn't so much things. We should have enough things, of course we should, to live the life that society is used to. But the most important thing to me is richness in terms of personal relationships, richness in humanity, which doesn't rely so much on things, but on our individual and collective development. So things like music, things like the arts, things like sports, things like, debating, learning, philosophy, education. To me, that's more what it is to be human than Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and how many billions of dollars they've got, or how many big cars people have, or stuff like that. In terms of Ant, I mean, you're having an argument about a subject, that's your sort of perennial subject. I'm talking about program. That's what I'm not going to say I'm going to ignore all of that. What I would say is the idea, for example, of demand, which is a demand that can be met under capitalism. The demand, for example, which a lot of the left laugh at, we want a people's militia. Presume, and you would dismiss that. Oh, that's just a load of rubbish because it's a capitalist. Okay, well, all I can say is I don't recognize your Marxism as the sort of Marxism upheld by Karl Marx. If we look, for example, at his the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, this is the how should we put it, the program that the Communist League fought for in the German Revolution. It has the demand: a popular militia, replace the standing army. Every social democratic party had that demand. No one dressed it up as this is socialism or communism, but is this strengthening capitalism? I would argue, no, it's strengthening the working class. You know, universal suffrage. So I do know, maybe I don't know if there's anyone from the Socialist Party of Great Britain on this, but if I read rightly, the comrades in the SPGB opposed universal suffrage in the 20th century because they said we don't want to campaign for bourgeois women to get the vote. Well, okay, I do, but I also want working class women to have the vote. So you have the bourgeois suffrage movement. They wanted bourgeois women first, and at the socialist movement, people like Clara Zetkin said, no, everybody should have the vote. Well, I include the bourgeoisie in that. Is that a socialist demand? Well, it's a demand of socialists, yes. Should we oppose that in the SPGB way? No, I think that would be outrageous. If we look at Marxism, I think Mike McNair has been quoted. He made a good point to me. You know, if you look at Lenin's little pamphlet, it was written for an encyclopedia, 3 sources and 3 component parts of Marxism. And he talked about English economics. Okay, Adam Smith was Scottish. Okay, he also talked about, what was it? French politics and German philosophy. Hegel, you know, Feuerbach. But Mike, I think, made the valid point. What about the Chartist movement, the British Chartist movement? Well, I would include that as a component part of Marxism. And what did it campaign for? Universal, okay, male suffrage. And again, what Marx said, well, you know, if that was realized at the time, that would have been the working class coming into power, because it also was equipped with what was called the social charter, right? So, you know, I don't recognize Ant's Marxism. I recognize it as a form of leftism, fetishization of Soviets. I recognize that. He's clearly a sincere revolutionary. I'm not taking that away from him or anything like that. But I don't think that you've got a realistic program, Ant, when you simply reject, I think, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, you reject standing in Parliament, not because we think that's about coming to power. I've already made my argument there, but to reject it, or for that matter, trade unions. Why can't we win trade unions? Why can't we win local councils? Why can't we win the popular militia and use it for our purposes? I would say we can and we should. Does that mean that's a specific socialist demand? No. Does that strengthen the bourgeoisie? No. So we need to strengthen the working class under capitalism. That isn't anything about coalition governments with bourgeois parties or anything like that. We reject that. We say that we would only go into coalition on the basis of our minimum program. And so maybe there are 3 working class parties. We turn and say, why didn't we form a coalition? After all, the Bolsheviks, okay, in Russian conditions, formed a coalition with the left SRs and adopted their agrarian program. Maybe that was a mistake. You could argue about it. But if they didn't do that, they wouldn't have had the majority. So these are questions that we aren't faced with. But our approach certainly is maximum democracy under capitalism, because this prepares the strength of the working class. And if you don't prepare the strength of the working class, and the working class learning politics, what's our attitude towards the bourgeoisie? What's our attitude to splits and divisions in the bourgeoisie? What's our attitude to the middle classes? What's our attitude to oppressed countries, oppressed nationalities? We need those sort of politics if the working class is to constitute itself as a ruling class. So yeah, so this is what needs to be in the program. It doesn't give you all the answers, but it gives you broad outline. It gives you key pointers in terms of how you deal with the now and how you deal with the tomorrow. And precisely, you know, Tina, you raised the question of the transition. It's precisely with that in mind that I would say that we do need demands that not only incorporate, championing the working class under capitalism, but we need to be thinking about, do we want the middle class just to be dumped on by the banks, for example? That doesn't mean being weak on corner shop owners or anything like that. But we do need to be looking at that class under capitalism, and also, as I've made the argument, also look to the voluntary principle when it comes to the transition period. The transition period, in my view, we need to be prepared. Again, this is just my own take on it. We need to be prepared for some difficult times. And that's why, I think that to the extent that we can diminish the forces of counter-revolution, we need to be thinking about that now, and not simply, for example, saying, oh, all the middle classes, they're just working class and they will all be with us, problem solved. I think that there's a reality, if we look at real revolutions, that we need to learn those lessons. There can be a mass counter-revolutionary movement. We need to be seeking to divide that. We need to be seeking to diminish it. And yeah, that's why we need a program that even thinks about such questions today. Maybe I'm completely wrong and everything is smooth. But hey, let's not bank on that.
Thank you, Jack. And just on that point you made, I mean, we do the CBGB talks in its program about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the transition period. You're talking about difficult times ahead. This is, of course, we have the Corbyn party when it comes. We've had somebody like Salma Yaqub saying, we're not going to use words that we've used in the past because they've got all these bad connotations like socialism, and that's going to be, people were linking us to the Soviet Union, etc. We don't want to, I suspect they won't use words like the dictatorship of the proletariat either, which of course we've studied this before. Hal Draper explains the way it's been used by Marx and Engels just means the rule of the working class, but it is a particular rule, a particular period in our future and our past, and when we've had it in the brief periods, which is, as you say, difficult times. Is there a point trying to dress it up as something different, using different words to perhaps not put off people, or do you think we have to reclaim these words and just explain why, hopefully, when we're trying to do it again, we're going to do it differently?
Well, you could do that as an experiment. I mean, Lenin argued, I think, sort of right, that if the Bolsheviks, who used the term RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which of course they were attacked as being German agents and agents of the devil and all the rest. He said, look, if we call ourselves the party of pink fairies, they will turn pink fairies into a swear word. So we saw it under Corbyn, when he led the Labour Party. He apparently is a raving anti-Semite. So, okay, we don't use any of these bad words and we pretend that we've just come from nowhere. Salma, no, you haven't. You were in respect along with George Galloway, guilt by association. Okay, Jeremy Corbyn, you write in the Morning Star. You were a member of the Socialist Campaign Group. So is Salma Yaqub going to denounce socialism? It's just, to me, we can make a political decision. We either defend words and say, no, that's really us, or you say, well, the other lot can have them. Clearly, if you take the Marxist movement, I don't know what they first called themselves, but clearly Karl Marx became a convert to some sort of communism. I don't know exactly when, maybe 1842, 43, I'm not sure, somewhere around that. But of course, he radically remade communism from an elitist, educative dictatorship into a mass movement of the working class itself. But it's also true, we've got it in our little caption to Peter Kennedy's article in this week's Weekly Worker, that after the Cologne Communist trial, 1852, when 6 of the comrades were found guilty and sentenced to quite stiff sentences, they stopped using that C word. So, you know, so our movement has called itself Social Democrat, for example. Now, again, not because I'm attached to these things, but as far as I know, Marx and Engels called that a pig of a name. Okay, but I mean, if history gave us Social Democrat, we would live with it. I mean, if you look at Lenin in 1916, I think, he writes about getting rid of the word Social Democrat because it's associated with Kautsky and Bernstein and the centrists, but also the pro-war right. He says we want to discard that. But again, if we actually look at 1917, the masses don't let him drop the B word, the Bolshevik word. That's how they know them. And although he says it's, again, to use that, it's a pig stupid name because this associates us with the Mensheviks, who we don't want anything to do with, we have to live with it. Okay, they did drop the name, kept it in brackets after RCP, but nonetheless, you know, but we're not a mass party. So you either decide, and I've made the argument, you can either say, okay, we're the real communists, they're going to call us bad names anyway, so whatever name we adopt, it's going to become a bad name. So I'm making the argument that I'm a genuine Marxist. We have to have an argument about that, but I would, you know, make that argument. Stalin betrayed Marxism, Kautsky betrayed Marxism. That would be my argument. But yeah, we shouldn't fetishize words. I just finished with this, Tina. I'm just looking at, you know, my friend Nick Rack saying that he wants to drop the name CPGB. I'm not wedded to it. I mean, the state that we actually live in is called the United Kingdom. So if we wanted to follow the sort of standard Marxist approach, you know, from the time of the Third International, we call ourselves Communist Party of, and you name the state, just like Rosa Luxemburg. She was Social Democracy of, it's a bit of a mouthful, of the Kingdom of Lithuania and Poland, which was actually a political Russian part of Poland, Kingdom Poland. They called themselves that. Okay, you know, maybe we should call ourselves the Communist Party of the United Kingdom. Okay, I can sort of, it would create some sort of problems in Northern Ireland. It would include the word kingdom in it. Either way, that would be a scientific description of it. But okay, so the comrades are saying, Nick is saying, we'll call ourselves Communist Party. So what do you call yourself then? Revolutionary Communist Party? You don't call yourself the Communist Party of somewhere? I mean, I'll finish with this one. Clearly, Peter Taff thought, well, let's just call ourselves the Socialist Party. That's a good idea, he said. And his minions obviously said, Peter, you're a genius. And then when it came to the Committee for the Workers' International and their Polish section, their American section, their French and German section, they had to call themselves of England and Wales because he'd already hived off Scotland. So you end up with a rather unfortunate name. So Spew was born that way. So, okay, you know, if I was, you know, if I had to live with Spew, I'd live with Spew. Not a name I would choose myself, but if I had to live with Communist Party of the United Kingdom, I'm not going to fetishize it. But again, this is a political judgment. And I'm simply saying that the highest achievement of our class, modest though it is, was 1920 and the formation of the CPGB. Why? Because it was connected with the Third International, with the October Revolution, with the working class for the first time in any real meaningful way, establishing state power as opposed to the Paris Commune, which was just in one city. So we can discard that. Okay, but I think that we'd be missing a trick at this stage in history. If we were dealing with a party of tens of thousands or even 5,000, I'd be much more free and easy about it. But we're dealing with handfuls at the moment. And we've got a big name for a tiny organization. And it's an advantage for a tiny organization to have a big name, in my opinion. We are not a party, but we have a party ambition. and a party history in that sense. Rotten one, but nonetheless a party history.
Thank you very much. How about the Communist Party of the European Union, Section UK?
Well, yeah,
That'd be nice.
except we're not in the EU anymore.
Well,
So
yes.
yes, I would definitely have gone for that. I mean, we did advocate it, if you remember.
Yes, I do.
Communist Party of the European Union, absolutely. Bracket, UK section, absolutely in favour of it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you very much, comrades, for participating, listening, contributing. We are continuing the series next week with Mike McNair, who's looking at the history from Chartism to the Erfurt program. All things we've touched upon today, but we'll go into it in a bit more detail. Hope to see you then. Thanks very much, Jack. Bye-bye.